I'm very well, thank you. It's lovely to chat with you today.
It's good to see you. Please, could you introduce yourself for the audience at home, please?
Yeah, well, my name is, well, I've got a choice of two names. Gloria Ann of the bloodline Moss, which is the living woman, or the legal fiction, which I have now controlled by the Office of the Executor, is Gloria Moss. And, well, we can touch on these two names and why we need these two names, perhaps as part of our conversation. But in terms of my background, I've got a fairly eclectic background, I'm delighted to say. I've spent a lot of my life in industry. Got a background in human resources, and I specialised on the training and development side, and worked in industry for many years as a training and development manager for some of Britain's largest firms. A big chemical firm. I worked on the biggest manufacturing site in the UK, just outside Derby, for several years, organising plethora of training programmes for apprenticeships. Could take people right up to being graduates, through to shop floor training, graduate training, welder training, you name it. And then from there, it couldn't have been more different. I was headhunted into Eurotunnel, the precursor of Eurostar, and I was responsible for the management training there and the language training. And then I moved into academia. I'll explain why maybe later. And spent many happy years doing extraordinary research, sometimes on my own, often in teams, because I'm a great team player. And I'll talk about some of that research in a bit. For 20 years, I focused on sex difference. In fact, that was the reason I went into academia, to pursue that research. Not on androgyny, no, you heard it right, to pursue research on cognitive sex difference. Then things got difficult in academia, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to speak truth. And so now I'm established Truth University, and I became a professor in the mainstream British system, and I was also visiting professor to a French business school. And the experience I've had in mainstream academia gives me everything I need, really, to start something new, Truth University. And we publish books, and we've published several books. And so here I am. I'm still an avid researcher, researching, you name it, everything from how we've been trapped in the system through our legal fiction. That's our Ms. Gloria Moss name. Everything from that through to history. Have we been lied to in history? You're nodding. Yeah. I've looked at the Great Fire of London, the plagues. What's the real backstory behind these events? I would suggest very different from what we've been told. So there we have it.
Well, this is why I've asked you, and you very kindly agreed to speak with me today, because there's a lot of information there that we can really drill down on and find out what you've been doing. Could you explain the term post-truth for us, please?
I'm so pleased you asked that question, Emma, because I think this is the backdrop to where many of us find ourselves today, living in a post-truth world. And post-truth means deliberately or ignoring reason, rationality, facts, science, knowledge, and statistics to follow an agenda not rooted in fact. And this is not a marginal concept. And the reason I say that is because in 2016, the Oxford English Dictionary named this concept of post-truth as their International Word of the Year. And it hasn't just popped up from nowhere. The commentator Hannah Arendt, in her essay Lying in Politics, 1972, she describes what she terms defactualization, which I think is equivalent concept to post-truth. This concept that she described in Lying in Politics in 1972, she termed that defactualization. And how does she define that? She defines it as the inability to discern fact from fiction. And she saw the origin of that, interestingly, in advertising and consumer society. I don't think we need to expand on that, with presumably the money motive as a big motive behind why you might not tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth when you're advertising a product. And could it be the money motive that underpins some of the post-truth that we are living amongst today? I don't know what you think about this, Emma.
Absolutely, that is that definitely rings a lot of bells with me, that we're not being given the truth, and I think we all really kind of on a deeper level feel that that's the case. Whether or not we're willing to acknowledge that that's the truth of the matter that's another conversation, isn't it? So that's the problem that you've outlined there. How does that tie into then promoting the idea of critical thinking?
Well, as I said, the definition of post-truth is the deliberate marginalization of reason and rationality, knowledge and statistics. And the link to critical thinking is, if we can restore critical thinking, then we undermine this the operation of post-truth, because post-truth cannot flourish, cannot be accompanied by rationality. I think rationality, fact, evidence destroys post-truth. In fact, I know that it destroys post-truth. And this is the reason that I, back in 2022, wrote a book with Catherine Armitage on the power of critical thinking. And this was our title, Light Bulb Moments and the Power of Critical Thinking. And, you know, we don't need to go to the barricades. If everybody simply sharpened their mental faculties and applied critical thinking with our minds, there's my co-author, Catherine Armitage, then post-truth wouldn't have a chance, would it? And some people who've read this book have been very kind about it. They said it's the best book they've ever read, and they've read it several times. And the reason they might have read it several times is because there's a lot in this book. And I'm not just plugging it. That's not the sort of person I am. If I'm pushing it, it's because of the importance of restoring critical thinking to our world. And restoring because in the national curriculum, for example, and I know we're going to talk about education later, the term critical thinking only appears in relation to two subjects. One is art and design, and the other is history. Now, it should be in every discipline, I believe. I'm an educationalist. My whole life really has been spent in putting forth information. That's what I was doing when I was a training manager in these big corporations, and it's what I was doing in the academic world, where I became a professor. This is the bread and butter, really, of what education should be about: critical thinking. I think it begins and ends with critical thinking, and it's to a great extent absent. And the OECD undertook a substantial survey in 2021. I think it was a survey of 800,000 new graduates, and they wanted to see to the extent to which they demonstrated critical thinking. And they found evidence of critical thinking in these new graduates in under 50% of those new graduates. And what's more, they didn't find any evidence of a learning gain across the span of people's degree studies. So there wasn't an improvement, if you like. And the other interesting thing is they found greater evidence of critical thinking in the humanities students than in some of the STEM students. And we're living in a world where STEM, science, technology, is being pushed at the expense of humanities, languages, history, English.
That just reminds me of Follow the Science. Yeah, just that it is that is a given, that is the fact, and that's we're pressing on ahead, and that's the end of the exploration. If you start on a foundation that isn't actually solid, you can end up in all sorts of weird and wonderful places, can't you?
Well, that's not solid, and the editor of the Lancet has very recently said that they don't want people just to submit articles willy-nilly. No, they're going to they want to select articles that fit in with certain agendas. That's a peer-reviewed journal. That says something about where peer review, which is the foundation stone of academia, can't get a job in academia without your clutch of peer-reviewed journal articles. I mean, I have myself, in the course of my career in academia, I've written more than 70 peer review articles and conference papers. And I've peer reviewed submissions myself. I've been and done it, but you can't but be aware of the extent to which, in submitting papers, you're aware of the fact that your paper is very likely to be rejected if it doesn't conform with a particular agenda. And that's not just my voice saying that. There's a whole literature on the lack of validity of peer review. And that could be a subject for another talk. I've given talks on that subject. There is a massive literature on how flawed this process of selecting what passes as knowledge in the peer review journal system, how flawed that whole system is. And I don't say it with a chip on my shoulder, because as I say, I've had published more than 70 peer-reviewed journal articles or conference papers, and I was only in the academic system for a relatively short period of my career. So I was working very hard, and I've written 8 books and so on. So I know the system from the inside, if you like.
So just going back to your book, Gloria, would a teenage child, perhaps a home-educated child or a child at school even, would they be able to read and understand the book? What level is it pitched at?
That's a really interesting question, Emma. This book is designed pretty well for any audience, be they wherever they are on their thinking journeys, whether they've not started to think, or whether they've travelled the long journey for a long time, as you have and as I have. But the first paragraph you ask about children begins, if I could just read the first paragraph of this book, it begins with the story of a child. Every Friday, Oliver would come from school for his piano lesson. He was an energetic 11-year-old who liked to play his piano pieces at top speed, often to the detriment of accuracy. Sometimes the same mistakes would occur again and again, despite the teacher pointing this out. She then closed the piano lid and talked through the problem that Oliver was making, pointing out the patterns in the music and addressing his mind rather than his fingers. When he opened the lid, he played the problem passage again, and this time played it perfectly. This was a light bulb moment because Oliver had worked things out in his mind.
Excellent.
So would that appeal to a child? I'll put the question back to you. That's the introduction. That's the first paragraph of the book on the power of the mind.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the whole crux of everything, isn't it? If you can understand, if you can understand the world, you're going to find it a little bit easier. I mean, the answers are there, aren't they? But it's giving children the tools to navigate and find the truth. That's what we want to do.
And this book is in 3 parts. So there's a lot of variety. We all like variety in books. And you don't have to read it from beginning to end. It's a book you can dip into. So the 3 parts. The first part sets the scene for critical thinking, how it works physiologically. And there is brain chemistry behind light bulb moments. And there are many factors in our society that obstruct critical thinking. Not just the lack of teaching of it or the lack of emphasis given to its development, no, but groupthink, social norms. It can be quite difficult for an individual to stick their neck out and say, actually, I don't agree with what you're saying. So there's all of that, and there's a wealth of social psychology literature that discusses the power of these social norms. And we could talk about that at length because it's fascinating literature from the social psychology literature. And then there's television and how that shuts down, in a physiological sense, critical thinking. It shifts thinking from left hemisphere to right hemisphere.
Can you explain a bit more about that, Gloria? I think that's really interesting.
The power of the television and what it does in a physiological sense is in this book, and underpinned by research, and it impacts the brain in 3 or 4 ways. It's very significant. You might think if you were trying to control people's thinking, the creation of the invention of the television by Logie Baird was a stroke of genius. Not just because of the information it can put out, but because of the effect it has on the brain, that it puts you in an alpha state, for example, so that the information that you're receiving is received in a hypnotic state, and so is taken on board in a very powerful way. And then the way the thinking is moved from the left hemisphere to the right, which is not the logical part of the brain, that means that the information isn't being dissected in a critical way. So there's all of that on television. So that's part 1. The middle, if you like, we could call it the meat of the book, I don't know. But there are 24 magnificent first-person accounts from many, many people on their critical thinking light bulb journeys. And this is where the variety comes in. You can just dip in and read 1 chapter. You can read a chapter by John Hamer, who's written several books on the falsification of information. He's written a magnificent book, The Falsification of History, another one, The Falsification of Science. He's written on the Titanic and the real story behind the Titanic. Well, he's contributed a chapter on how he came to ask questions. And one of the things he writes about is hearing from friends in France at the time of the death of Diana, that they saw footage on French TV of Diana walking from the car into an ambulance. And that got him asking questions, as it would, of course. And then we've got chapters, well, I'll just read out the sectors, the that these 24 accounts cover, that I've written a chapter on critical thinking and how spotting anomalies is the trigger to finding truth. You find two facts that are discordant. Just the example of Diana is one. How could this person who walked out of the car have been so critically ill as to die? That's an anomaly, and you weigh up the two sides of the anomaly and find truth. Then there's Sir Julian Rose on farming and the importance of good farming. There's chapters on money and money creation. Law and order, 4 chapters on the corruption, no less, within these sectors. Health, how somebody moved out from mainstream health as a nurse and forged a journey as a naturopath. Chapters on education, on history, politics, contemporary affairs, contemporary culture. That's a really interesting one. There's a chapter by Niall McRae there, Dr. Niall McRae, asking whether the underpinnings, the factors that underpinned the Chinese Cultural Revolution, he describes as the eradication of the 4 C's. I'll say what those are, whether that applies to what's happening to society today. The eradication of the 4 C's that applied in the Chinese Cultural Revolution, that was the eradication of culture, customs, ideas and values. Is that what we're experiencing in much, or certainly in Western society? The eradication of culture, customs, ideas and habits. And in which case, it's the exportation of cultural Marxism to the West. And again, I think the way we fight that is with critical thinking, with sharpening our thinking and questioning everything that's happening. And then finally, there are chapters on culture and philosophy. Evil, there's a chapter by Neil Kramer on evil. He takes the view that evil is there to sharpen us, that negative as it is, it can have a positive effect because it sharpens our sense of integrity and righteousness. And that leads to a final chapter on spirituality and do we really live in a purely material world, or is there a lot more? So that's the middle of the book, these 24 first-person accounts by some remarkable people. Mark Devlin is there talking about the music industry. That would appeal perhaps to young people, and how that music industry is being controlled.
Yeah.
Very much controlled. And then the final part of the book is drawing the different strands together, asking why are some people more likely to want to ask questions than others. And I talk about some research I've done on that topic, including research on personality type. And we can talk about that. That's fascinating findings that certain personalities, as measured by the Myers-Briggs type inventory, I don't know if you know that one.
Yes.
BTI. There's certain, I don't know if you've done your type, but I can talk about that. It's really quite simple.
I'll just go back to your point about the book there, Gloria, about I think it's fascinating that you bring up the concept of evil, but it's again how you frame it, and it can be a really positive mechanism to finding a better solution. Because, like you say, you're having to work harder to compensate for that, and hopefully you will find a better way. So it's actually a positive process.
Yes, if the world was purely good, we might be completely lazy and not do anything.
Which I think, again, with the television aspect of things, a lot of people probably have fallen into that false sense of security that everything is comfortable and nice and easy and safe. But it's a dangerous place to be, isn't it? Complacent.
It is. And you abdicate your responsibility. You become couch potatoes.
Yeah.
We used to live in a world where people made their own entertainment in the days before television and recorded music. And people would play instruments. There's a vast amount of piano duet music written for four hands at one piano, two people playing together. There are duets that created that play out Beethoven symphonies, for example. People couldn't go and just switch on the radio. They would play a Beethoven symphony written out as a piano duet on the piano. There's a vast amount of piano duet music, which I think, written by Schubert, by Brahms, wonderful music. And this tells us something about our past, that people used to be very active, entertaining themselves. In Jane Austen, we hear about the girls in Pride and Prejudice who play the piano. It was a stable of life. And they put on theatrical entertainments, I think, as well. Now, television has removed all of that very active participation in entertaining ourselves and maybe creating drama as well. And so fighting evil maybe restores people's sense of responsibility as being responsible for their lives and taking action.
Yeah. And it's a bit of a glib saying, but if you don't use it, you lose it. So if you are just absorbing and observing rather than participating, you are effectively shutting down parts of your brain, and presumably
so
it's
important what you've
dying
said,
off.
Emmy.
Yeah,
and that's the sharpening of the mind. And when we talk about education, there's been such a dumbing down, and I'm not just talking in a vague sense. It's been catalogued. For example, modern languages. I studied modern languages at university, and so I'm very interested in modern languages. It's in a very, very bad place now. And GCSE modern languages covers French, German, Spanish, and something else. There are four. I can't remember what the fourth is. The vocabulary count for these, well, if I take French, it's the same vocabulary count for all these. The vocabulary required is equivalent to the language of a 3 or 4 year old in the native language.
Yeah.
And it's 17,000 words, I believe, that's required for a higher level GCSE, modern language. And where French is concerned, a study was undertaken to estimate the vocabulary requirement for an O-level in French in the 1960s. And the conclusion of that study is that the language count required for an O-level French in the 1960s was very, very close to double that required today.
Right. Yeah.
This is shocking, given what you've said. If you don't use it, you lose it. Recently, the Department of Education has announced, I think, that standards need to be brought down still further. For the well-being, they say, of children. No, it's not for the well-being, because those children's minds will not be sharpened and they won't reach their potential. That's what I think as somebody who spent most of my life in the business of imparting information and developing people. That's what gives me pleasure in life, seeing people develop, like watering a plant. And if you drop standards as low as they've become, then you're not doing people you're doing people to disservice.
No, not. Could you please explain a bit more about personality types?
Yeah, with pleasure. I won't go into the MBTI, the Myers-Briggs type, in too much detail. We can do that another time. But this test was created by mother and daughter because they thought if you could reveal differences in the way people perceive the world and people understood those differences, then they could understand each other better. And they spent their lives dedicated to creating this MBTI, Myers-Briggs type inventory, which is in fact the most widely used psychometric tool in the world. So there's a massive amount of data behind it. And it's based, what they did was they created a psychometric instrument which uses Jung's personality types. And they're dichotomous, that's to say, they measure introversion, extroversion, they're opposites. And they measure 4 opposites, and I won't go into all of them today. I'm a trained user of this test, so I know a bit about it. And I'll just focus on one dichotomy for today, and that's the dichotomy. And the names of these types are a bit misleading, so I'll need to explain what they mean. So here's a distinction between the sensing type and the so-called intuitive type. And the sensing type, as measured by this instrument, corresponds to people for whom reality consists purely of the world delivered by their 5 senses. So imagine that. The world you inhabit is what you see, what you touch, what you smell, and you don't see beyond that. And the intuitive type is very different from that. It's nothing to do with intuition. It's a very misleading term. The intuitive type, so-called, is the type that can perceive the world of possibilities, not just the world delivered by the 5 senses. And so we've got the sensing type abbreviated to S, and we've got the intuitive type abbreviated to N. And I have been running conferences for several years. I've been running a questioning history conference and a questioning science conference. And during in the run-up to one of the questioning sciences conferences, I asked people if they'd like to volunteer to do this test, this personality test. And incidentally, the people who come to these conferences, they're questing people, otherwise they really wouldn't come. And so they're wide awake, avid searchers for new information, new truths, if you understand what I'm saying, Emma. And so, and I also asked people in the local stand in the park, which is a group where people come together to share information and truths. And so I've got a sample of 85 responses. Okay, this is where I nearly jumped out of my chair with the results. If we take UK, which is the country I'm based in, and we take all the data, we look at the data from the Myers-Briggs type on the distribution of the sensing and the intuitive type in the population at large, what would you think? Do you think most people in the population are sensing or intuitive types?
I think most people are sensing.
Correct, spot on. So in the in Britain, according to the data from the Myers-Briggs type inventory, it's 63% of the population who are sensing.
Okay.
And obviously that leaves the balance are intuitive. They're a much smaller proportion of the population. And well, I've got data here showing the proportion of the population that's intuitive in different countries. In some countries, it's even lower than it is in Britain. So if we take Germany, only 26% of the population there are intuitive.
Wow.
Canada, likewise, 26%. Australia, it's slightly under the numbers in Britain. And when I jumped out of my seat, one of the things that made me jump out of my seat was Ireland, for example. 42% of the population there are intuitive. and Russia, 45% of the population, Poland, 46.5%. Now, going back to my sample of 85 people who were attending, so against the backdrop of Britain, where 37% of the population are intuitive only, should we say?
Yeah.
In my sample of 85 people, over 90% were intuitive. These are the people who attended my questioning science conference. And so, what does that tell us? I think this provides part of the answer.
Mm-hmm.
If you have that personality predisposition to see the world of possibilities, you're much more likely to ask questions than if you are the sensing type. On the other hand, it doesn't mean, I think, that the sensing type can't ask questions. Were the television, with all of its graphics and sound so brilliantly framed for the sensing type, appealing to their auditory and visual, priorities, were that television to beam out truth, then the sensing type would absorb that. I'd be very interested to hear your reactions to this.
I mean, you can place people that you know in your personal life into these scenarios, can't you? And really feel what you're saying there. I wonder if there's a correlation between, I don't like the word well-being because it's overused, but happiness, general satisfaction levels. I wonder if there's a correlation there with those personality types and whether or not it impacts your ability to regulate your emotions, if you like. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I don't know the answer to that. But I could imagine that the sensing type, they may well derive their sense of well-being from satisfaction of their senses.
And it may be that you place a higher emphasis on how you feel right now, as opposed to long-term well-being goals.
Interesting. It could well be the case.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I think this is a very, very big factor, whether you are a sensing type or an intuitive type.
Mm.
And that's it. So we have 37% of the population in Britain who are intuitive, so-called. This book, I imagine, will appeal more to those types than to the sensing, although the concrete reality presented here through the first person accounts, they're like people telling their stories, and we all love reading a story. They're all written in the first person I. Maybe that will engage. I think it's a book for everybody of all ages.
It certainly sounds like it would be well worth promoting to home educated people as well.
Yeah, because so many sectors are covered in these first person accounts. There's a chapter I've just opened at random by an American, Shannon Rowan, who's co-authored with John Hamer. She's EMF sensitive, and she's talking about her journey in dealing with this electromagnetic frequency sensitivity. The title of her chapter is "Breaking Free: How EMF Harm Led to Mental Liberation." And here's her first chapter. It's very short. In early 2014, my world completely shattered after I returned from Bali, Indonesia, to Washington, D.C., USA. I travelled for 30 consecutive hours, with all that time spent on aeroplanes and in airports. On returning to my apartment, I collapsed and was bedridden for nearly a week. I do not remember much from those days. It was as if I was only half alive, barely conscious. So there's stories. We've got stories told in this way. Would a child want to read on after that first paragraph?
I don't see why not. It's it must be from a child's perspective as well, that they are being bombarded with so much authoritarian concepts and ideologies that those children may be seeking some sort of rebellion from that as well, and actually seeking that alternative viewpoint because they're starved of it. I know that's certainly the sort of child I would have been, that would have been seeking out the alternative.
Brilliant. So maybe it would chime. And in her chapter, she goes on to talk about the friends who died in 2001, the 9/11 attack. And she reflects on that, and so people will learn from those reflections. There's an awful lot of information across all of these sectors, but it's not presented in textbook form. It's presented through the first person, readable accounts. I edited the whole book with Catherine, and we worked hard to produce a very readable style. People have said.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that myself, definitely. Would you also give us a bit of a background on the work on history that you've been doing?
The work on history? Well, there's the little word story hidden in the word history, isn't there?
There is.
Is it a true story? Is it fact or fiction? The version of history that's handed down to us. I'm very interested in looking at his history in that respect, and looked at many topics, but just to flag up one, which is taught, I think, in every primary school, and that's the Great Fire of London, 1666. And what were we all taught at school? What's the fact we were all taught? That it started with a fire in Pudding Lane, and it was the fault of one Thomas Fariner. Well, when I started looking into the Fire of London, a very different story emerged. A story that very different from the mainstream version, that maybe removed the burden of negligence from the shoulders of Thomas Fariner to the authorities of the day. And, well, there's so much to say. There's so much interesting evidence. Everything is about looking critically at the evidence. So, for example, the mainstream sources, be it the Science Museum, the BBC, you name it, a lot of them blame the fire on the fact it was a hot, dry summer that made the timbers rife for fire. Here's the Science Museum writing that the fire followed an unusually dry, hot summer. Well, you would believe the Science Museum, wouldn't you? Unless you don your critical thinking hat. I've had these mugs created with Catherine. The power of critical thinking, question everything. Is that true, what the Science Museum says? Well, I've written a little booklet here under the imprimatur of Truth University Press. I don't know if you can read the title there.
Yes, it's clear.
Plagues, pandemics, and raging fires, playbooks used in resets, past and present. And research shows that London, despite having very hot summers, had experienced no really large fires in the 4 centuries before 1666. And there were scorching hot summers in 1630 to 1637, and also in 1653. There were no big fires in those years. So could the Science Museum be wrong in suggesting that the hot summer led to a single fire in Pudding Lane, spreading across the city? Well, of course, the mainstream also talks about the power of the wind. And they say it was because of the wind that this great conflagration emerged. And even at the time, the London Gazette referred to a dry weather, that's the hot bit coming in again, and a strong easterly wind. And lots of commentators, contemporary commentators, noted the strong easterly wind. But then there were some thoughtful folk like John Evelyn, who wrote a diary. He described the fierce eastern wind, but noted on the 3rd of September 1666 how the fire kindles back against the wind as well as forward. Now, what does that sound probable? I mean, can that happen, that the fire goes in an opposite direction? And Thomas Vincent, who was a nonconformist minister at the time, contemporary, he referred to the strange spreading of the fire on the 2nd of September, also noting how the fire worked fast against the wind. And indeed, the fire was spreading against the wind. It was spreading from west to east, and not just that, it was spreading north and south. And so these mainstream authorities that blame this on the wind, and purely the wind and the hot summer, are they correct?
Doesn't sound like it.
Doesn't sound like it, does it? Something else must have been happening. And a bit of pottery that had been found, burnt, charred pottery, near Pudding Lane, they tested that, and they found that bit of pottery had been subjected to temperatures as high as 1,700 degrees Celsius. Now, that's enormously high temperatures. So one's bound to ask, how could temperatures as high as that have been created? Were they created naturally or unnaturally?
That's a hot summer, Gloria.
Mm-hmm. That's
a very hot summer.
Yeah, that was a really hot summer. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And so you see how critical thinking helps one forge a path through all of this to the truth. And this booklet notes the fact that at the time, Stuart England had advanced knowledge of incendiary techniques, because while the fire was going on, the English were burning a town in Holland, West Terschelling. They burnt it to the ground. And they also the English used fire ships to burn up to 170 Dutch merchant navy ships. So they knew a thing or two, I think, about fire at that time. We have the evidence. It's all in the evidence. And speaking of evidence, what do you think about this? On the day before the fire, on the 1st of September, John Gaunt, who was a newly appointed trustee of the New River Company, and that's a company that had created a canal that diverted river water into a reservoir in Islington. On the day before the fire of London, 1666, which started on the 2nd of September, on the 1st of September, he turned off the water supply. He's the newly appointed trustee of the New River Company. He turned off the water supply, locked the door, and disappeared, taking the keys with him. And the next day, I'm just reading from this booklet, the next day when the fire started to blaze, there was a problem with the local water supply, of course. And so how could they get water to put out this great fire in a most inefficient manner? Loose chains of people passed buckets of water up from the Thames. And not surprisingly, that had little effect.
Wow.
And there's much more evidence besides how slow the authorities were to react in putting out the fire, how marshals did nothing. But after the fire had stopped, and it took several days, it raged for many days, the authorities were extremely quick to put in a plan for the so-called rebuilding of the City of London.
Did they build back better?
Love it. Well, they say they built back better, but this pamphlet is asking whether the buildings that they alleged they rebuilt after the fire were actually already there. It's a bit complicated to get your brain around.
Okay.
Because some of them were built with remarkable haste. In fact, a speed which I think is completely unrealistic.
Okay.
And so could this have been a repurposing of history? They were rebuilding history and giving a new history to some of the remarkable buildings that we are told emerged post-fire, including all of Wren's buildings. There's a lot about Christopher Wren in this pamphlet and how, in fact, he had no training as an architecture. We're told he was possibly Britain's greatest architect, but he was an astronomer and a mathematician, and he had no architectural training. And even St. Paul's Cathedral, which we're told he designed, even well, there was a page, it's been taken down from the official website of St. Paul's Cathedral, but there was a page which you can get through the Wayback Machine, where they got a grant to look at all the drawings that they have at St. Paul's Cathedral and separate out the drawings into the designers who were responsible for those drawings. And even the official archivist at the time, or the man brought in to do this research, proclaimed that no more than 10% of the drawings were the work of Christopher Wren himself.
There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there?
So did he design the 50-something churches that we're told emerged post-fire? And there's, well, the histories of many of those buildings, and not just those buildings, you know, the Sheldonian in Oxford, where graduate in Oxford. I went there for the degree ceremony of a family member, and the person presiding said, this wondrous building was built by Christopher Wren. But in this pamphlet, we ask questions about that assertion. That there are no designs left. None of the original designs for that building. So there's a lot to, as you say, there's an awful lot to unpack. I'm just reading from this booklet. A model for the Sheldonian Theatre, beautiful building, shown to the Royal Society, was actually made by the Oxford mason Mr. Bird. And we're told it was made to the specification of Wren, but there's no evidence cited for that assertion. Who knows? Could these buildings have been the work of an earlier civilization, a civilization referred to as Tartarian, and that the Build Back Better was rebuilding history and repurposing history, so that the work of the previous civilization was being represented as the work of a newer civilization? It's a lot to take in, I realise that.
Fascinating, though. Fascinating. Could you explain, this is one that I'm really interested in discussing as well, is the research that you've done on sex differences in relation to vision.
Well, yes. Another hot topic, shall we say. I spent 20 years researching this one, and maybe we could talk about this another time, and I can show lots of images. I was working in industry at Eurotunnel, the precursor to Eurostar, when I went to a watercolour exhibition in the Strand. No, not the Strand, in gosh, I've forgotten the name. It's the grand road that leads up to Buckingham Palace. And there was an exhibition there of watercolours, and the paintings were for sale, and they didn't indicate against each painting what the price tag was. So the catalogue was expensive, so I just jotted down the numbers of the paintings that appealed to me, and then I sneaked to look at the catalogue. And this was back in the 1990s. What I found, I thought, that's interesting. Most of the paintings on my shortlist were the work of female watercolour painters, female watercolour artists. And I thought, well, maybe most watercolourists are females. And I had another look at the catalogue and, in fact, saw a lot of male names. In the end, I bought the catalogue, and with the help of a friend, we did a statistical we did some statistics and on my findings, or on my preferences, and found that in relation to the gender balance of the artists, what had happened to me was freakish. You know, the statistics were off the scale, as highly improbable that I would collect an almost all-female shortlist of painters in an exhibition where, in fact, there were more male watercolour artists than female. And so I thought, am I peculiar, or is there something about the world? And the first thing I did was undertake a literature review to see what had been written on this subject. Do male and female visual creations and preferences differ? And this was the era of men are from Mars, women are from Venus. I thought there must be literature on this topic if it was a real phenomenon. And back in the 1990s, I couldn't find any research at all. And being the sort of person I am, I wanted to know if I was weird or whether this was something about the world. And I thought, if this was something about the world and a real phenomenon, my goodness, wouldn't this have implications? I was thinking, what would the implications be, for example, for marketing, if women prefer the visuals created by other women, and if male and female visuals differ, and if women prefer the visuals created by their own gender, this would have a massive impact on product design, on advertising, on web design. And I thought I must find out more. And so I left the world of industry and started out on research in this field. And it was a very, very fascinating but rocky ride, because what I found over the 20-year period was, no, I was not strange. This is a phenomenon. I've conducted innumerable experiments where I've laid out controlled designs. When I say controlled, I used to go to art colleges. I used to photograph the work of foundation course students near the beginning of their training. I didn't want them to have too much training because I wanted to get the natural impulse as much as I could. And I would collect a sample where all the students, male and female, were producing responses on a single topic. That's what I mean by a controlled sample. And I would then show the designs, like if I can show you these images another time, I would then elicit the preferences of unsuspecting males and females. I would ask them which ones they prefer. I wouldn't tell them that some of the designs were created by males, some were created by females. It was blind in that sense only. And the results, and I've done this with graphic design, product design, web design, off the scale again. In statistical terms, the results are all highly significant at the 0.001 level for anybody who understands statistics. Highly significant. This is a very, very important, strong phenomenon, and I've written about it in a couple of, apart from peer-reviewed journal articles, I've written a mass of them, and my PhD is in this area. Some of it, this work is summarized in this book, Gender Design and Marketing, which is a bit pricey. It's not the popular book, although it's written in a very readable way. And you can find that on Amazon, and lots of reviews, both on the American Amazon.com and on the British Amazon.co.uk. And I'm happy to say only 5-star reviews for this book, with people in industry. There was a head of a marketing, an advertising firm in America, who waxed lyrical. I discovered, I got in touch with him, that he had discovered in his journey in advertising that actually the adverts that are produced are geared not so much at the consumers. And by the way, 83% of all purchases are made by women. Take that in. He discovered that most advertising is aimed not at the 83% of consumers who buy product, but aimed at the juries who run the award bodies that give advertisers the gongs that allow them to rise up in the advertising profession. And guess what? Most of the members of those juries are men. So he found that a lot of the advertising that is created is actually very masculine in its orientation. He'd already discovered that for himself. So what this book does is it actually charts in very great detail the elements that will appeal to both audiences of men and audiences of women, both in terms of themes and in terms of color, shape, dimensionality, and detail. So it's a new science, and it was a rocky ride. Why do I say it was a rocky ride? Because I started this research in the 1990s when androgyny, the idea that you can select your gender, was becoming ubiquitous. And so this didn't fit well, my findings in that world. I don't know if you can relate to that, Emma.
Yeah.
In the research on sex difference and cognitive sex differences, I was looking at the visual. The visual is said to be the biggest area of sex difference after height. Of course, men, by and large, are taller than women. And this is what I was finding, these massive differences in the designs that male and females create. And I wrote a popular book as well, with different material, actually. The material is not a copycat of the material in this book. And I don't actually have a copy. People have bought copies and I don't have any left at the moment. But the title of the book is Why Men Like Straight Lines and Women Like Polka Dots. And the straight lines, in all the designs I've looked at, men favor the use of straight lines, boxes, rectangles, and women favor the use of rounded shapes.
Yeah.
And I think you can take this back, all of this. And polka dots, women like massive amount of detail. Men like sparse detail. It's all very fascinating and very complex, because when people study design and architecture, what's downloaded to those students is the male aesthetic preference.
Mm.
And the female aesthetic preference gets pushed out and downgraded, in fact.
Mm.
So there are implications here for the assessment of art and design and architectural creations, and the assessment and promotion within industry, because those who create according to the male aesthetic, for as long as the directors of marketing are male, the directors of design, the directors of web design, and these fields are largely male dominated, the female aesthetic, which we need because 83% of purchases are made by women, will be marginalized. So we end up with a crazy situation where organizations are not optimizing their design. They could make a lot more money if they use the female design aesthetic.
Yeah, if they responded to what was true.
And if they responded to the truth, yes. And now in a world where we're told you don't need to be born female to have the attributes, well, what I can say from my research and from my reading of the extensive reading of the psychology literature, for example, is that Professor Geary in America published a book on the five senses, and a magnificent book published by the American Psychological Association. He charts in his book differences in how the five senses manifest in males and females, massive differences. And you could argue that all these differences serve an evolutionary advantage over the long term, just as the visual serves an evolutionary advantage. So men have, in the visual, this is well attested in the psychology literature, their eyes are actually spaced slightly further apart than women's by a few millimeters. That gives them better stereoscopic vision, very helpful if you're hunting. They have better targeting accuracy than women by virtue of that. And they have less good colour vision. A higher proportion of men, 10%, than women, 0.5%, have colourblind, are colourblind. And that serves an evolutionary advantage because being colourblind helps see through camouflage. So that all plays into being a hunter and strengthening your capacities as a hunter. And I think it's just my hunch that men's predisposition for straight lines, has that come from centuries? Because apparently we've been hunter-gatherers for 99% of human history. We haven't just been sitting on comfortable chairs for that period of time. Could this predisposition for straight lines have come from focusing on the distant horizon for all that time and looking for prey in the distance against a straight line? Question. Because women have a much greater preference, as I've seen in my design studies, for rounded shapes. And how could that have helped women? Well, women were gatherers, they were picking the berries, so their preferences would be attuned to the rounded shapes. Women have vastly superior colour vision. I'm not speaking from my research, this is other people's research. Americans have estimated that up to 50% of women may have a fourth colour pigment. No man has more than 3 colour pigments. And when you go from 3 to 4 colour pigments, you go from being able to see millions of colours, that's men, to being able to see hundreds of millions of colours, that's women. So women, and American researchers have estimated it's 50%. I don't know how they estimate that, but that's what they estimate in a peer-reviewed journal article, with all of its flaws, a very technical article. Women have vastly superior colour vision. Was that an adaptive mechanism to being gatherers, needing to see ripe from unripe berries, to being the social managers of the day, responsible for base camp, needing to see if the adults were about to, their cheeks were getting red with temper and they needed to calm them down. They were the main nurturers of the day, looking after the infants. They were the architects of the day because men were away hunting. And if you look at what's described as primitive cultures. I don't like that term, primitive. If you go into the anthropology literature and look at the buildings that were created by women, they're all round in shape. We live in a world now where we don't often see round buildings because responsibility for architecture has moved over time from men to women. Sorry, from women to men. That's not how things were in the past. And that movement that I've said happened in architecture and in management, because I said women were the leaders of the day, men were out hunting. So women were responsible for base camp. They were the leaders, the managers. This movement away mirrors the movement from matriarchy to patriarchy, essentially. Just some facts. Stone Age, which spans the period from 2.5 million years ago, if you can get your head around that, to 9,600 BC, the mother figure was prominent in the Stone Age. It was a women-centered society. This I take from a book by Backhoven, 1961. He described, or she, I don't know if it was a man or woman, the society as women-centered. And of course, cave art emerged during this period, and that's the period 23,000 to 25,000 BC. We have a lot of cave art, and many people listening will be familiar with the Venus figurines. And if you haven't seen them, take a look. These are very rounded women, not the all slim archetype at all, with big breasts. Venus figurines, they're hundreds, hardly any figurines of men. And there is, if you go into the art therapy literature, you'll find evidence, and I found this in my own research on gender and design, that people tend to depict people of their own gender. So I would argue that these figurines, very likely produced by women, that the original artists and cave artists were women, not men. Based on very detailed evidence, I assert that. And the themes that inform the paintings, the prehistoric art, are more expressions of life than violence. And that's what we find when we look at research on male and female drawings and paintings. The girls tend to depict life, plant life, human life, and men, males, boys, depict inorganic objects, cars, trains, or themes of violence. So do you see, the past may have been very matriarchal, and then, and sticking with cave art, there are a lot of depictions of pregnant animals, for example. And peaceful portrayal of dangerous adversaries. It's a very peaceful world that's depicted in cave art. And there are a lot of round shapes, and there are a lot of handprints that have been found on caves. And they're small handprints, not large handprints. History has said that the cave artists were male. I question that based on just some of the evidence I presented today. Now, there was a matriarchal period in Egypt from prehistory until the appearance of Osiris in about 3000 BC. Things then changed from matriarchy to patriarchy. Until then, there was goddess worship. I noted down the names of two goddesses, Uazit and Nekhbet, or Nekhebt, Nekhbt. And then the change happened when Egypt was invaded by Mesopotamian people with the concept of kingship and a male deity. And at that point, there was a paradigm shift from matriarchy to patriarchy. And that was complete in Egypt by 1570 BC. And the rest shall we say, is history. And we live with the legacy. We live in the legacy of that patriarchy. And it's going so far now that the whole notion of natural female biology is in dispute. But I think it's very interesting to look at this as a, as a piece of history and how things have changed over time. I'd be very interested to know what you think, Emma.
I'm just blown away with there's so much information there, Gloria, that and the bigger picture. It's so important that people explore the ideas that what's happening today isn't necessarily a unique situation, that it's been a long time coming, that there's been a lot of there's a lot of patterns to spot in history that would explain the mess that we're in today, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I'm where's this taken us, this patriarchy? If you go into the National Gallery, well, I did the work to find this statistic. The proportion of paintings in the National Gallery in London. What is the proportion of paintings in the National Gallery by men and by women? Well, you might think, because it's called National Gallery, that we would have a fair representation from both men and women. Well, I just counted up all the paintings on the National Gallery website and noted down the incidence of male and female artists. And what I found was that 0.5%, less than 1% of the art in the National Gallery is the work of women.
That's incredible. I mean, that is so fascinating. That one statistic is incredible, isn't it?
And there are 14 paintings in the National Gallery on I think this is paintings on display. I'm not talking about paintings that may be in storage. 14. And people will say, "Oh, women didn't paint." Nonsense. There's a remarkable gallery in Washington, the Museum of Women's Art, and I went there. I didn't while I was in Washington. It's a feast for the eyes, with paintings going way back to at least the 16th century, and other art forms as well. Why has this happened? Why has women's painting been marginalized? Well, you could say, people say women didn't paint. I said, no, there's no evidence for that. They did paint. You've only got to go to the museum in Washington to see that. They did paint. So what other reasons could be found for explaining the marginalization of women's art? And it's not just old art. I mean, if you go to the Museum of Modern Art in America, only 5% of the art on display there is by women. So how do we explain this? I have some ideas.
Please share them.
Well, there's two types of discrimination. There's conscious discrimination and unconscious. There's direct and indirect discrimination. And, well, you could say it's direct discrimination, that men didn't like women to be famous artists. I'm going to put that argument to one side. I have no evidence for that. Let's explore the evidence for indirect. In other words, applying criteria that one group can more easily satisfy than another group. That's the concept in employment law of indirect discrimination. And so if you ask for people who can run long distances, that would be indirectly discriminatory to the disabled or to older people, because you're applying criteria that can more easily be satisfied by one group than another. Does that make sense, Emma?
Absolutely, yeah.
So in the field of art, do you remember I was saying that in these 20 years plus of research that I did, I found that the designs of males and females differed in very systematic ways in terms of the shapes they used, the colours, and dimensionality. I found men's art to be and designs to be much more three-dimensional in character than women's. And that may be from their better, do you remember I said their eyes are spaced further apart? They have better sense of three-dimensionality than women do. And so could it be that quite unconsciously, men who have been art collectors through the ages unconsciously indirectly discriminated against women by preferring art that had the male aesthetic characteristics in it? So more greater dimensionality, darker colours, more serious tone. I'd like to suggest that this may be a major factor that has selected out female artwork and will go on selecting out female artwork for as long as we don't have equal numbers of men and women on panels making decisions. And for as long as training, whether it's art and design training or architectural training, doesn't factor into it the female aesthetic as just as valid an aesthetic as the male aesthetic.
That's fascinating. Thank you so much for that, Gloria. It's really important work, and I think my husband's red-green colourblind, and so is one of our daughters, which is obviously quite rare. So
half a percent of women are colourblind. You know that they exist. Yeah.
It's but it's been absolutely fascinating to discuss this and learn a little bit more. And I certainly will be exploring your books and reading those and sharing my findings and your books with my home educated children. Before we wrap up for today, is there anything else that you would like to bring to the audience? Any other aspects of your work that you'd like to touch on before we go?
I would simply go back to where we started and say, do we want to live in a post-truth society? I don't. I don't want to have to live in a world where I'm served up falsehoods, because why don't I want that? I want to have a genuine experience of life. I don't want to live in somebody else's reality. And equally important, if we don't get to the root of things, can we ever really solve problems? What do you think, Emma?
Absolutely, it's impossible, isn't it? If we're fighting against make-believe problems, what are we doing? There must be a better use of our time and energy, and it is all found. The foundation must be what is true. So that is the adventure, isn't it, of finding out the truth?
And it is an adventure, a very exciting one.
It is exciting, and it's a positive message. So to finally wrap up, we'll put all the links to your books and to your website in the description on this interview. But if you just want to again run through your website so that people can find you, or on social media, Gloria.
Yeah, with pleasure. Thank you, Emma. The website is this is Truth University, www.truthuniversity.co.uk, and you can buy the critical thinking book from there. If you prefer not to buy from Amazon, please do buy from Truth University. And then the email, if you're interested in getting a copy of the booklet that I showed you, which you can't get through the website, and definitely can't get through Amazon. It's for private circulation if you like this booklet. There's a lot a lot. When I say a lot, an awful lot in this book, which I haven't talked about today even. Plagues, pandemics, and raging fires. Email, the following email, info@truthuniversity@protonmail.com. That's info@truthuniversity@protonmail.com. The cost of the book is £11 plus postage and packing. And what else? I think that's it, isn't it? Oh, I do podcasts regularly, and if you want me to send any of the podcasts, then email me for those. I did a podcast a couple of weeks ago for talking about the gender stuff for 2 hours, and I can send links, or maybe you can put that on the description.
Absolutely, will do, Gloria. It's absolutely fascinating to talk to you. I'm so grateful that you've given us your time, and we hope that you continue doing this important work and sharing it with the rest of us.
Thank you so much, Emma.